is to have the orchestra surge and be gorgeous and absolutely colorful, but never get in the way of the singer. So he sort of marries the two ideas. The plot, as I've already mentioned, is simple and straightforward. It's not complicated. You know, compare that to a lot of earlier operas. My favorite one to talk about is Trovatore, which has the most outrageous plot of any opera ever, right? It involves babies being thrown into the fire, and it's the wrong baby, and who, I mean, it's impossible. This is pretty clear and straightforward. There's not much confusion here about what's going on. But as I'll try to point out later, it's a lot more nuanced than you might notice at the outset. So that's part of the beauty of this. There's always more than meets the eye, and it invites further listening, further study. As many of you are doing, you're coming back to hear it again because you love it so much. And finally, Puccini has a remarkable sense of dramatic pacing, and what I mean by that is he allows things to last long enough for you as the audience to appreciate them, but doesn't, as the singers will attest, leave the singers hanging on stage with nothing to do, which can happen in opera. You sort of are there, and now what do I do? I think, for instance, I adore Mozart, but the singer singing Constanza in the Abduction from the Seraglio has to figure out what to do during about a 5-minute introduction to Marginaler Arten. And it's impossible. Puccini never does that. Things take as long as they need to take and no longer. So those are some qualities that if you actually hit all those marks, you're going to have a pretty strong opera, aren't you? And maybe a perfect one. So let's take some of these in kind of order. Characters and situations. This is one of the first operas to use characters who are ordinary, everyday people. There are no noblemen here. There are no aristocrats. There are no historical figures. And there are no characters from mythology. And if you think about just about all the operas you know that are earlier than 1895, the characters are all that, including even in Carmen, which is often cited as a forerunner to this style, but the tenor is Don José, which means he's a count, right? So this is a break from tradition. Now it's a new style that's emerging. It emerges first in France. Usually we say with the novelist Émile Zola, who writes in this realistic verisme style, and it's adopted in opera where it's referred to as verismo. Probably the most famous verismo opera is I Pagliacci, or its companion piece, Cavalleria Rusticana. Very ordinary people in, again, these situations of jealousy. And as I say, while the story may be familiar to the point of being almost a kind of cliche, it's always affecting. It's the story of a whirlwind romance, difficulties, and the tragic ending. And I already mentioned a couple of familiar films like Love Story, A Walk to Remember, The Notebook, Me Before You. We see this plot in some form over and over and over again. We never get tired of it. Romeo and Juliet, for that matter, right? I mean, it's as old as the hills. So let's hear some singing and demonstrate at least some of these things. Here are the two lovers, Rodolfo and Mimì. Now, we say lovers, they've only met about 10 minutes ago in the course of the opera, but they're already declaring undying love for one another. And the thing is, and I really mean this, Puccini will convince you that this is possible. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the 10 minutes or so leading up to this, but it's very familiar. First, Mimì comes in. Well, we've had this painter and this poet who are lamenting the fact that their attic is very cold, so the poet decides finally to burn his play. You know, whatever. And a few other things happen, and then Mimì comes in, the leading lady comes in because her candle has gone out. I always wonder if this is a pretext to meet the cute guy upstairs, but whatever, okay? Her candle's gone out. He lights the candle. She gets outside. The candle goes out again. And she comes back in and this time drops her key. And they go searching for the key. And that's when he discovers that her hands are cold and sings Che gelida manina. And he tells her about himself and she tells him about herself. And then we're to this point where they've obviously made a real connection. So this is O Soave Fanciulla, and our singers are Sam Krause and Catherine Grumley, and at the piano is Catherine Kozak, and I'm going to give you translation as it goes, I hope.
Dammi il braccio, mia piccina. Obbedisco, signor. Che m'ami di? Io
Really, we should just let them sing, and I shouldn't be too long. The music's so beautiful. Let me point out a couple of things, though. If you know the opera, you recognize that when he gave her his arm, the tune was the same music that when he touched her hand earlier in the act. I shouldn't sing either around these people. Right? And actually, a little bit of this is going to come back when Mimì sings Addio senza rancor, the same notes. So Puccini keeps connecting these situations and these emotions for us, and it has two benefits. One is that, again, it creates this deeper sense of truth beyond the words, but also it creates this feeling of familiarity that we've heard it before, because we have. Much of the music is it would be unfair to say recycled. It's used in a very careful way to create this consistent atmosphere and consistent idea. Now, I've alluded to the fact that the plot is pretty straightforward. Let me tell you just a little bit about where it comes from. It was a mid-19th century, it's often called a novel, but it isn't really that, Scènes de la vie bohème, scenes of bohemian life, or glimpses of bohemian life, by Henri Murger, who only lived to be 38 years of age. Much of the book is autobiographical. He bases the character of Rudolph in French, Rodolfo in Italian, on himself. Mimì is called Lucille in the book, and interestingly, she says when she introduces herself, they call me Mimi, but my name is Lucia, the Italian for Lucille, and that's never really explained, but I guess it's a little Easter egg for people who might have read the book. So it's really a series of sketches or vignettes, more than a novel with a through plot. What the librettists, Illica and Giocosa, have done is to create this through line by very carefully selecting just a few of those scènes to create this opera libretto. As I mentioned, the librettists are Luigi Illica and Giuseppe Giocosa. There's another opera with the same title, La Bohème, by Leoncavallo, that was performed the next year. And yeah, Puccini's wasn't all that successful, but Leoncavallo's was even less successful, and it sort of disappeared from the repertoire. You do occasionally see it done, I think, as a curiosity as much as anything else. I think the music's perfectly fine, but it's very much overshadowed by its more famous cousin. I think that the simplicity of the story is one of the things that makes this opera so strong. It allows us and the music to focus on the emotions of the situation, but also this colorful atmospheric music. There's a lot of the opera in which, to be honest, not much happens. But we're immersed in this wonderful festive atmosphere of Paris in the middle of the 19th century, or depends on where it's set, but originally in the middle of the 19th century, which is a place of sort of storied good times and abandon. And it's against that backdrop that this rather sad story takes place. Now, it's guilty of one thing, I think, and that is, in a way, glamorizing poverty, right? The happy peasant idea. And that's certainly true at the beginning of Act 1 and Act 4. These people seem very jolly, despite the fact that they're living in miserable circumstances. Of course, a garret looks a whole lot more expansive on an opera stage than it would look in real life, right? And there's an enormous thing that you think, wow, okay, it's a lot of space. Big studio apartment in New York. Hardly. I mean, it really is, it's the attic, and it's not heated, and it's really uncomfortable. Well, one of the places where there's tremendous atmosphere is the second act. This is the set design for the second act. Again, by Hohenstein, and it shows a street in Paris. There on the right, you can just maybe read that it says Café Mimì, which was a real place, really haunted by people who were in Montmartre and the Latin Quarter and those places in Paris where the artists hung out. And this is a fabulous scene with the chorus jumping around and being excited because it's Christmas Eve. That point is not often accentuated, but that's the idea. This is supposed to be Christmas, so Parpignol is selling toys and people are peddling food and so forth. It's a very colorful, wonderful scene. And we have a bit of an excerpt from that scene for you to hear. The foil to Mimì and Rodolfo is the other couple, Marcello the painter and his sometime on-again, off-again girlfriend, Musetta. Now, at the moment that we meet her in this wonderful street scene, Rodolfo and Mimì have gone out to go to the Café Mimì. They've met his friends there, just like they said they would do at the end of Act 1. And in comes Mimì with her latest gentleman, an old guy named Alcindoro, who she's going to get rid of by complaining that her shoes are too tight, so he goes off to buy her new shoes. But meanwhile, she's going to taunt Marcello, her ex-boyfriend, because she'd really rather be with him. And so she kind of lets him have it by talking about how everyone just admires her. And there's a little bit of, well, you see what you think of the text when it says, everyone looks at her and wonders what's beneath the surface. This is Melissa Solomon and Catherine Kozak once again. What I love about that very familiar song is, yes, it establishes something in the plot, but it also creates this sense of color, and it tells us a great deal about her character, doesn't it? It's not only the words, though, it's the carefree tune and that dancing waltz. That's why it's often called Musetta's waltz. So that's Act 2. That was it. Not really. I'm saving something for when you go and see the opera. But I want to show a little bit of a video and show you how Puccini creates a sense of atmosphere with just the orchestra alone. This is, to me, the very remarkable opening of Act 3. And I'm not going to say much about it. I'm just going to let you hear the music and you come to your own conclusions about what's going on here. Takes a moment to get to the right place.
Ehi, companiere!
Now, you couldn't see it, which wasn't the plan, but it's actually interesting. It's going to let me do something that I hadn't expected to do. Now, don't answer if you know this opera like the back of your hand. What time of day is it? Okay, it's certainly not bright noontime, is it? No. What's the weather like? Cold. This is early morning in Paris. Okay, so if you said evening, okay, but it's the people coming in to the town to ply their wares and so forth. And boy, does he let us know that it's cold and snowing, doesn't he? Just through the sound of that music. So the fact that you couldn't see it actually helped me make my point, because in the staging it's snowing and you see all this going on. I'm going to talk more about this, but understand that Act 2 also took place in Paris at night. So it's the bubbling nightlife. Now we're seeing the other side of that coin, Paris in the early morning when it's cold and frigid, right? This is all part of how this opera is constructed. Music that expresses deep emotions that go beyond the text. And here I think Mimi's aria from Act 3, which we're going to hear in just a moment, is a perfect example. This is a complicated scene. Act 3 is the crux of the whole opera, really. By this time, some time has passed. Mimì and Rodolfo have been together and have now split up because Rodolfo keeps acting jealous and angry, and Mimì doesn't know what to make of that, so she's going to leave. Meanwhile, Marcello, the painter, and Musetta, the coquette, have gotten together, only they're arguing. And it's all coming around to the usual sorts of things. This leads, after the bit we're about to hear, to one of the most remarkable quartets in all of opera, while these two couples are working out their different places in their relationships, and it's pretty obvious that they're foils to one another. But before we get there, Mimì sort of takes her leave of Rodolfo and asks him to just pack up some of her things. This is Donde Lieta, and we have Catherine and Catherine once again. Now, maybe you noticed that at the very beginning of that, the piano play, which is Mimi's signature tune. At the beginning of Act 3, when she comes in, before she sings, we hear that tune. We always know when she's on the scene because we're hearing that melody. And there are references all through that aria to the first thing she sang to Rodolfo, where she introduces herself. Again, Puccini keeps bringing back these little bits of musical idea to connect everything, but also to create this deep emotional world. If you look at that text, I'm just going to go back. I mean, this is pretty ordinary stuff. There's nothing really very deep going on here. You know, get my ring, get my prayer book. You can keep the bonnet if you want. But the music invests it with this great depth of feeling, doesn't it? Right? And that's what opera can do. Words alone are pretty dramatic. We like Shakespeare a lot, but there's a lot of ways to say to be or not to be. That is the question, right? In fact, there's a wonderful clip of some English actors all coaching each other on how to do it. Find that, you'll enjoy it. When you add music, you create a specific reading of the line, a specific pacing, a specific way of emphasizing certain words that then tells us what's going on behind the scenes, what we often call the subtext. What is the character thinking and feeling that they aren't saying? And that, I think, is what Puccini does so very beautifully. And other operas that I might name as the perfect opera. They give us the character beneath the words. And this is a beautiful example. Now, I want to go a little further. I'm going the wrong way. I kept going backwards. Here we go. There's an aspect to this opera that might not be immediately obvious, but that I want to point out for you to pay attention to when you see it next week. Because it's really quite extraordinary how this opera is built to create compare and contrast moments. And I think the real brilliance is in the ways the third and fourth act reflect the first and second act. So let me talk you through at least some of that. So first Act 2, I'm going to start there in the middle. Act 2 shows us, it takes place outside of the Café Mimì, shows us Paris nightlife, and it's the parallel stories of Mimì and Rodolfo getting together and Musetta and Marcello trying to get together. The act which follows is, in a sense, the obverse of that, the other side of that coin. It takes place outside an inn or a tavern, so that's a parallel, isn't it, right? And it's now Paris, not nightlife, but as we pointed out, this is now early morning, a very different kind of Paris, another way of looking at Paris. But again, we have the parallel stories of Mimì and Rodolfo and Musetta and Marcello, again, at different places in their relationship. By the end of the act, Mimì and Rodolfo will resolve to stay together until the spring, and Musetta and Marcello will have broken up in a very Italian sort of argument with lots of cursing at each other and so on. Even more remarkable is the way Act 1 and Act 4 parallel each other, to the extent that they actually begin with the same music. This sort of, again, the lively, lovely world of being a poor artist up in an attic. And it begins, both acts begin with them at work, with Rodolfo writing and Marcello painting, and things are distracting them. In the first act, it's the cold. In the fourth act, it's their troubled relationships with their girlfriends. A change happens when food arrives in both acts. In the first one, it's Schonard, the musician, who's come into some money, and he's going to take them all out to the Café Mimì. That's what's going to get us to Act 2. In this one, they actually come in with food and start eating and dancing around and jollity and gaiety, of course, to create the stark contrast with Mimì coming in very, very ill. In fact, she will die by the end of the act. In the first act, it's the landlord's arrival that disrupts the gaiety. He's asking for the rent, and they manage to get rid of him by getting him drunk. In the fourth act, it's Mimi's arrival that disrupts things. And then there's all kinds of parallels beyond that. Remember that Mimi's hands are cold in Act 1, Che gelida manina. In Act 4, they're cold again. She needs a muff. And I've said etc. because I don't want to keep doing this. But I ask you to pay close attention to this. You may not have noticed this before, but Act 4 is very closely patterned on Act 1. And I think Acts 3 and 2 are also meant to be reflections of one another, which I think is part of the whole bringing the opera together and why it's so satisfying to watch. A few things about the musical features. I am a music professor, so I have to talk about musical features a little bit without getting too technical. I've already mentioned this idea of what we might call signature tunes. Now, this is an idea that Italian composers got from Wagner, but they didn't use it in quite the same way. You know, the leitmotif in Wagner, where little musical things stand for ideas and he develops them. Puccini tends to use them as tags. So we always hear the same music when Mimì comes in. And you'll get to love that little gesture of music whenever she's there. The idea that I've mentioned about bringing back musical ideas to connect incidents, but also to provide a kind of musical unity. And finally, there's the unusual harmonies. You heard the kind of pentatonic sounds of the dum bum bum ba ba bum ba ba ba, the snow falling in Act 3, and all kinds of surprising chords all the way through that give it a kind of lushness. And then this very colorful orchestration. It's a huge orchestra required for this that involves harps and a big woodwind and brass section. So the singers have to be able to be heard above all of that. Puccini takes care of part of it. Part of his kind of singer that you need to sing this. But what it allows Puccini to do is to create this marvelous palette of sound that he uses so very beautifully. Now here's the list I gave at the beginning of what might make it a perfect opera, and I tried to touch on all of these, but there's one I haven't touched on, and that's the last one, a keen sense of dramatic pacing. And the reason I haven't is that we'd have to look at a whole scene or a whole chunk of the opera to do that, and we don't have time, and you know, although I would have happily heard them sing all of Act 1 or something, but anyway. So that's something for you to pay attention to when you see the opera. And I'll make a particular place for you to pay attention to it. And that's the end of Act 1. From the time Mimì comes in until the end of the act, how does Puccini make that scene work so that there's enough time for them to notice one another, but not leave them stranded on the stage with nothing to do? What does he do in the music to make you believe that these two have seen one another and just instantly sparks fly? There's a little pluck in the harp when they notice each other. It goes bing. And it's like the light bulb going off, you know? I mean, it really is, he really leads you right there. And then these lush, gorgeous melodies that take us even further. So that's my case for why Puccini's Bohème might be the perfect opera or one of the perfect operas, and why I am so excited that you're going to see it. Now, we do have a little bit of time for questions. If you have any, maybe we could bring up the house lights a little bit so I can see more than just shadows of faces. There we go. Yes?
Which came first, the music or the words?
The words. He asked me which came first, the music or the words. In opera writing, it's the words that come first. And Puccini was very particular about what he wanted, and so he worked very closely with the librettists. So there probably were times when he got himself into a place musically and said, you know, these words don't work, I need something else. We have some documentation of those kinds of things happening in various opera compositions, going all the way back to Mozart. But the words always come first. Unlike American musical theater, where very often the tunes come first. In a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, Rodgers writes the tunes, Hammerstein fits words to the tunes, but they know what the situation is when they're writing the song. So even there's some dramatic idea. But definitely the words come first in opera. I think I saw a hand. Yes?
You said that La Bohème was not accepted in the beginning. When did it change and why did it change?
It quickly caught on, and I would say by the time of Puccini's death, really only 20 years later, it was considered a masterpiece. Interestingly, though, each subsequent opera, Puccini would get criticized because it sounded too much like Bohème. So when Butterfly was performed first, which came next, it was booed off the stage. It's like all he's doing is recycling tunes from Bohème. Well, no, but Puccini always sounds like Puccini. I don't think that's a bad thing. You know, the people say, oh, Bernstein, he always sounds the same. Well, that's wonderful to have a unique voice. Nobody says that there's something wrong with Mozart because he always sounds like Mozart, or Beethoven, who always sounds like Beethoven. I don't know why that is. By the end of the 19th century, always sounds alike. Any good composer, it sounds alike. But so by the end of his life, it was very much accepted. I think the initial barrier was that thing of that it wasn't about the kind of people we were used to seeing, and that therefore it was a little vulgar. And there's still that reservation about Puccini. The fact that you all like it makes musicologists nervous. They think it must not be sophisticated enough if so many people like it. I say, you know what, if so many people like it, something's going on. It might be worth paying attention to. But isn't it true, musicologists sort of poo-poo this music. You almost never talk about it in music history class. They'll mention him in passing. Oh yeah, Puccini. But yeah, it's really great stuff. Yes, in the back.
Did it premiere in France or in Russia?
Neither. It premiered in Turin. Yeah, in Turin, yeah. So it's about France. So there's a little bit of an exotic element, right? These starving artists in this particular place, the Latin Quarter of Paris. It takes place in Paris, but it was premiered in Italy. No more questions. You're like my students. If we ask him a question, we might be here longer and we want to get to lunch. I understand. Well, thank you for your very kind attention. Let's thank our performers once again. And I'd like to thank Arizona Opera and the wondrous Cassie Hollerbach for the invitation to speak. Thank you. And we're all grateful to you. We don't get to do this unless there's an audience. So thank you for coming this morning. Thank you for coming to see La Bohème, and thanks for your support of opera in Arizona.